This is Boxes and Briefs, a podcast with real-life business stories. But we will be asking the hard questions and challenging traditions. So broaden your thinking with fresh perspectives and solve problems for business success. Welcome to another episode of Boxes and Briefs. My name is Lisa.
I'm Lucy.
And today we have with us Michael Masterson.
Yeah, that's okay. Everyone does that. It's because there's a town named after me that wasn't meant to be.
And he's from Intrinsika. He's a global intrinsic asset advisory, valuation and corporate finance specialist, that's a mouthful, who helps companies and investors unlock their competitive advantage by identifying, valuing and monetising their intrinsic assets. So my first question is, what the hell is that?
Which bit? That was a long intro.
That's a lot. What is an intrinsic asset? Let's start there.
Yeah, it's essentially what makes you special. So if you're thinking about it, like Gilligan Shepherd, what makes Gilligan Shepherd special? In fairness, it's probably Bruce. You know, it's good that he's not sitting here. But otherwise, you know, what differentiates one accounting firm from another accounting firm? And we've got a client in Australia, Kelly Partners, who's the fastest growing accounting firm, certainly in Australia. And that's evidenced by their share price. When we met Brett, a bit like a Bruce, a little bit more reserved, but, you know, incredibly intelligent guy, like off the charts intelligent. And his frustration was, hey, my shares are sitting at 80 cents.
Yeah.
I think I'm worth more than that. I don't know how to explain it. And that really comes down to the intrinsic assets, because it's not the tangible, because anyone can replicate, you know, the desks, the chairs, the computers.
The building.
Yeah, but to replicate that je ne sais quoi, you know, that
So
special
it's not
kind of
even
something.
the formula or the methods or the processes.
Well, it could be. That's the thing. It often is. And so to take Kelly Partners, because it's listed, so it's easy to look at what happened, is by helping Brett, first of all, understand what those assets were, because he comes from an accounting background. And these things are absolutely not captured, definitely not in your fixed asset register. Almost certainly the balance sheet and the P&L, they might be indicative, but they're almost not entirely capturing that value. So if you say, well, they're your three most predominant financial documents, because that's what the government and the tax authority tells us is important, and the accountants tell us is important, but that's not where the value is.
Okay.
And so I remember the head, I won't name which organisation, but very large global accounting firm.
Yeah.
Opening statement to me was, Michael, let me explain where I sit on. Back then he said IP, but this stuff. Balance sheets are bullshit and have been for 40 years because they don't reflect the value in a business. Now, if the head of one of the biggest accounting bodies is saying that, and he knew it instinctually, but he didn't know how to explain it. And so again, going back to Kelly Partners, Brett was then able to explain it, and within, I think, 3-4 years, their share price is now at $7.62, I think, as of last week.
$7.
$7.62.
Ooh. In what period of time?
3-4 years.
Wow.
Cool.
Okay, so
Now,
let's get into
yeah,
this.
exactly. So the tangibles didn't change. You know, yeah, they've brought on some more because they're essentially acquiring accounting practices. But what Brett, I think, in my humble opinion, got really good at was explaining that value.
Okay, so the value. Intellectual property rights, brand reputation, human capital, are they all contributing?
So the best way to think about an intrinsic asset, it's not just what makes you special, but it's what you can't kick with your toe. Because if you can kick it with your toe, that means it's tangible and it can't scale exponentially. E.g., this microphone, we can only use 24/7. Cannot be used anymore. Yet the manufacturer, I don't know if it's a Rhodes microphone, we've done a bit of work with them, but if it's a Rhodes microphone, it's the design, the thinking, the knowledge, the know-how. It's all of the things that turn it into, ultimately, a tangible could be the output, but the inputs are the intrinsic assets.
Well, I've heard people put values on things like that before, and it's very emotional.
That's part of the problem, is that we've seen a lot of what we call well-intended but bad valuations. There was one particular listed company in Australia, I won't name them, but let's just say that they went to Big Four accounting and said, we're worth $200 million, we're going to do an IPO.
Yep.
And guess what the valuation was? $200 million. And we looked at it and went, there is nothing supporting this valuation. Yeah, they had some intrinsic assets. They had a reasonable brand, you know, not a bad data set, but nothing to support the future cash flows that would need to support a $200 million valuation. Last time I looked, I think they're down to 40 million. In other words, what it means is it was worth 40 million.
Yeah.
Guzman and Gomez last week listed for, I think it was $8. These, you might not know them. They're predominantly an Australian brand. They do Mexican food.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And that's talk of the town at the moment because it went to, I think, $30. Now, everyone was saying prior, this is crazy, it doesn't make sense. Yet people paid $30 because that's what they saw the value. The value is just in the eye of the beholder.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the best way I can relate to it is watching the things like Shark Tank and Dragon's Den, and all of those people pitch their ideas and they say what they valued their business at. Sometimes it gets pulled apart, sometimes it's just accepted off the bat. But how do you identify and assess the value based in your field of expertise?
Ultimately, there's 4 key drivers that we see evaluation. So everyone focuses on the word valuation, and think about it like the seats that we're sitting on, which, if I think I'm right, they all have 4 legs.
Yes.
I didn't actually look though, I just sat in the seat. And evaluation's a bit the same. Until you put pressure on evaluation, you normally don't look at what's driving the valuation. There are 4 key drivers to evaluation, which is why, in our humble opinion, these are not what I would call accounting or pure financially based valuations. So the word even valuation is quite dangerous.
Okay.
So we talk very deliberately about explanations, because you go from something that is essentially finite to something that is open to a degree of interpretation. And the 4 legs that support that, first of all, they support the number. The first is, what are the underlying assets? Now, if they're not captured in those financial documents, where are they? And so the biggest issue we find in most companies, including, I suspect, Gilligan Shepherd, in fact, I know because I think I asked the question of Joshna, you guys don't have a list of these intrinsic assets.
No.
So if you don't know what they are, then how can you then factor them into a valuation?
Okay.
The answer is you can't. That's why most valuations are either under or overestimated.
Right.
Now, they fall into 10 core categories. And it is things like brand and knowledge and know-how and trade secrets. And it might be, registered rights like patents, for example. But for the most part, it's sitting in things like know-how. Again, think about what makes Gilligan Shepherd different from other accounting firms. I could go and set up an accounting firm next door, call it Mike's Accounting, but that doesn't make me Gilligan Shepherd, even though I'm next door to you. So we're in the same spot. I've got the same desks, chairs, everything else. But I don't have, first of all, the brand. People don't ring up Gilligan Shepherd, or in my case, Mike's Accounting. Second of all, I don't have someone like Bruce. And Bruce is a character unto himself. Let's be grateful there is only one. But I also don't have that knowledge and know-how. Now, I can acquire the knowledge and know-how by, unfortunately, hiring the staff from Gilligan Shepherd across. But again, it still doesn't make me Gilligan Shepherd. So what we find is that that first group, we're still on the first leg, break down into 3 main categories. 90% of non-physical assets are easily replicable. I can replicate your website, I could replicate the podcast, I could do all that. That's actually not that hard to do.
No.
But the next roughly 9% of volume is roughly where 9% of value typically sits. And again, in most businesses, especially services businesses, it's things like the knowledge and the know-how. Yet the 1% that's remaining in volume is typically where the 90+% of value is sitting. And it's almost certainly in an established business sitting in things like the brand, e.g. people used to deal with Bruce, now they deal with Gilligan Shepherd. But it's absolutely in the relationships. It's that you can ring someone up and they'll know Joshna, they'll know Humphrey, they'll know Bruce.
Yes.
So you've also got those interpersonal relationships. Now, unfortunately, if those people left, almost certainly those relationships move across too. So that's the first leg.
And therefore the value leaves too?
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. The second leg is the context for that valuation. So are you doing it for tax purposes? Might be a bit conservative.
Yep.
Are you doing it for relationship property? Depends on which side of the equation you're on.
Yep.
Are you doing it because one of the big 4 wants to buy you? Because you've got something special. You've got something that they don't want to buy, but they actually have to buy. So context is really key. And typically you're worth more in much bigger hands than smaller hands, because the other party's got the ability to pay a lot more for that.
Right.
The third element is timing. And, we had a client, Glide Path, What I can say, I can't say the absolute quantum, but that transaction got done in January 2020 for tens of millions of dollars. 6 weeks later, what was that business worth? They're in baggage handling. 6 weeks later, January 2020.
Right. Yeah, of course. Not very much.
Nothing.
Zero. Yeah. In fact, now
Just zero.
it was almost certainly probably a liability because you actually had to fund the business.
Yeah.
It's not an asset anymore.
Yeah.
Right.
Now it's probably worth maybe double because travel's obviously come back.
Yes.
So timing, as COVID taught us, can be really critical. And
Yeah.
some industries had their value pulled forward in terms of what their valuation was. Others had it pushed out.
Right.
Okay.
And this is where you see a lot of mispricing of assets, in particular public companies. And the last leg of the stool is the most important. So even if you're really lucky and you just happen to have got the others right, at some point, the person you're dealing with, and again, if you're normally being bought by a very, very large business, the person you're dealing with is normally not the person who's going to hit approve on that transaction. They normally need to go to an M&A team who might have to go to a credit committee, normally on the other side of the planet, who, depending on the quantum, might have to go to a board. If you can't explain to that person, and explain is critical, why it's worth that to that organisation and why they should absolutely buy it, then that board member or whoever's hitting the
They're
approve
never gonna
button,
be able to relay
never
it.
going to happen.
Yeah.
So you find most deals fall over at the start, but almost certainly at the very end, because you don't have access. A little bit like dealing with the bank. You know, the good old days, you'd explain to your bank manager and hope that they could explain why they should give you that loan in your business to the other people. It's no different. And so that's very much art, not science.
Yeah.
The ability to negotiate. In fact, I remember Bruce teaching me this lesson, God, probably 15 years ago. He and I were in a negotiation together. And
Opposite or together?
no, we're actually on the same side.
Excellent.
Luckily, yeah. Yeah. That was bad enough, let alone being against him. So, Bruce called a break. I said, "Oh, what's up?" And he said, "I've just realised something." I said, "What's that?" And he said, "The other side doesn't know how to negotiate. We're going to have to teach them." And so that's what we did. We actually taught them how to negotiate. That art and the ability to sit down with a large multinational, understanding that the person you're probably going to do the deal with, that it will take 6 months, they'll probably leave their job because big companies turn over.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to build multiple relationships within that other organisation. So if you're a small scale or even a mid-size, New Zealand company, even if you're 50 mil, you normally don't have these skill sets within your business. And it's not a legal or an accounting function. It's a business function.
Yep.
And it comes from having done lots of other deals like that. So we're very lucky that we get to do these. We're doing one with one of the world's biggest medical device companies at the moment. We're doing another one in Saudi Arabia with one of the richest people in Saudi. And this is art, not science. And the deal you're doing in the US is very different to Saudi Arabia.
I'm kind of getting the impression, the way I'm relating to it, is that we do a lot of content writing for businesses.
Yeah.
And when I ask them what their point of difference is, 50%, more than 50%, will say something that is just your standard table stake. It's the same as everybody else. But those who can articulate their point of difference, what their value is and what they do, those are the ones who not only get the work, they get the connection, they get the alignment, and everything just happens after that.
So you're absolutely right. And I remember I was speaking at a conference last year, and we worked with this particular client who was a professor, and everyone said is uncoachable. And the next day they all had to give their pitches. And the pitch was 30 minutes. And I'm like, okay, this is not going to go well because it is a relatively complex product. So over the next 4 beers, he and I worked on answering my favourite 4 questions that I had never got round to writing down. So I wrote them on a napkin.
Okay.
The first one is, what do you do? If you think about the IMs that certainly, I've seen, I hate to think how many thousand, but most IMs, it's not until, by the way, this guy's IM was 96 pages.
Oh, who's going to read that?
Exactly. And it's actually a bit insulting because you're insulting someone else's time. But we often see early stage and scale up companies make that mistake because to make something complex is really easy. To make something simple, really hard.
Yeah.
So first question is, what do you do? Second question, why do people buy from you? Third question, how am I as an investor going to get my money back at a greater rate of return than my alternatives? In other words, why are you special?
Yeah.
And that comes about because of question 4. And even in IMs, if you eventually work out those 3 questions, very rarely, if ever, have I seen question 4 answered. And question 4 is, how are you going to stop or slow down competitors from replicating what you do? Because
Love
that
that
is
question.
the link to margin and/or market share, which is what this is all about. The reason we all come to work is that the people who are paying us and entrust us with their money, the shareholders, want a return on their investment. It's about return on capital. So those 4 questions, we were able to get down for him to under 30 seconds.
Okay.
And he gave his pitch the next day, and I literally said, you've just got to trust me on this. And I had people coming out going, oh my God, if you can do it with him, you can do it with anyone. And that's the thing. We were talking about Apple before.
Yes.
We know what they do.
Yes.
We know their customers are.
Yeah.
We certainly know how they generate a pretty good return on investment.
Yep.
But 4, we understand why they stop their competitors. In other words, why are they not Android? And that's because if I want access to the Apple ecosystem, and in particular the App Store, I have to do it with an Apple product.
Yes.
I can't get there without. If I want stuff to just all work together, I've got to go with Apple. Apple have really focused on, it's just easy to use. It is pretty much idiot-proof, which is why I don't have Apple. So those 4 questions, I would say, are probably our greatest frustration in that everyone overcomplicates everything. Remember I was saying at the start, most people even overcomplicate this topic. This topic is, how do I make a return on investment that's better than any others from my idea, both in terms of my capital but also my time. So I'm sure when, Gilligan started with Shepherd, however many years ago, apart from going, God, why did I pick this guy? They were doing it because they thought this was a way to make money.
Yeah.
Or an access to money. That's why we all get into business. We want to make the world a better place, probably, almost certainly, but we're doing it because we want it to pay us better than maybe a job or less frustration. In other words, there are reasons, and they are very tangible.
Yeah. Okay then, well, can you give me an example of a company that had a value just based on the norm, and then one that's worked with you guys?
Yep.
And the differences between that value?
Yeah, look, there's 2 that spring to mind. The one that's the easiest one is the one that everyone said was worth 0.
What's that?
So a company called AirTrunk.
AirTrunk.
So AirTrunk's had a lot of press, in particular in Australia, in the last couple of weeks, and I'll explain why. So I had just got back from Singapore, and I get a call from a guy called Robin Cooter, and Robin says, hey, I've basically been to the Big 4, and they've all told me to go get a job. I'm valueless. I'm like, what do you do?
That's very disheartening.
But that's pretty typical.
Yeah.
And in fairness, 90% plus of most startups fail, so maybe they thought they were doing the right thing. But the thing is that they were looking at it from the wrong perspective. And like a glass of water, there are 3 views on just a glass of water. If it's half full, there's half full. But from the bottom it looks full, from the top it looks empty. In fact, often you need to find the 4th and 5th. In fact, I once won lunch with Bruce because I said, you can overfill a glass of water. He said, no, you can't. So I did. The meniscus goes above the top of the water, top of the glass. Yeah, it cost him lunch. So AirTrunk was really interesting. The first question I said to Robin is, what do you do? He said, I've come up with a way to run a computer data center at half of the operating cost of everyone else. Immediately, he's also just told me, because it's a computer data center, I know who his customers are. But more importantly, he's just told me, like in one sentence, he's told me that he has a 50% cost advantage, where
Over
typically
his
data
competitors.
centers are 1 or 2% variance.
Right.
That's a massive margin, which you can use to either as retained earnings, or you can use it to keep growing market share. So in the first opening sentence, he's told me the first 3 things that I need to know. The 4th question was what I asked him, Robin, how are you going to protect it? And he said, I've seen a patent attorney, they're going to file a patent for me. I said, okay, but the way that's going to work, Robin, is no judge is going to give you access to Google or Amazon's data centers, because they're going to take what's in your patent, they're going to drop it into their data center because it's too big a cost advantage, and they're not going to pay you anything for that. And he's like, you're right, I hadn't thought about it. Should I go get a job? I said, no. He said, but you just told me I can't protect it. I said, no, you're using the wrong tool in the toolbox to protect it. And patents are very rarely the right tool. But when they are, they're a great tool. But for the most part, in fact, according to the USPTO, 98.4% of the time they're the wrong tool.
Wow.
Because that's the percentage of US granted patents that never generate $1 in revenue. Yeah.
Right.
There's
Pointless.
a stat most people don't know. But again, they can, like you and I wearing glasses, if you want to tighten your glasses, you need a really fine screwdriver. And that's what a patent is. They're a really fine screwdriver. When you need it, they're awesome.
Okay.
But for the most part, you don't. That's not the way to protect it. So we said, well, Robin, we protect it by trade secret. In other words, we just stop people talking about what you do and we manage it and put measurement around it. So that's exactly what we did.
Clever.
We then valued the business at about 100 million. Now, at that point, I was literally getting calls from friends of mine at the Big Four going, you are insane. Like, you have no idea. You don't know what you're doing. Yeah, it got quite bad.
Oh.
Gets
you
better,
kept
though.
going.
Yeah. Well, he then took that to a firm in Australia called Grant Samuels. And Grant Samuels got hold of, we used to call them valuations, now we call them value explanations, but they got hold
Okay.
of that document
Yep.
and it explained where the value was in the business. And in particular, you've always got to link it back to future cash flows. You can't just go say it's going to be $1 trillion company without explaining it, obviously. No
Yep.
one would invest in that. Well, some people will. So Grant Samuels then worked with Goldman Sachs, got the first raise away. 3 days in, Robin rings me. I still remember I was walking down Orchard Road in Singapore. And he says, Mike, I don't know if this is material, but we've just signed Microsoft as one of our first clients. I'm like, holy heck, Robin, you've got to stop the raise. He's like, Mike, I'm doing presentations. I can't. I said, no, your valuation is wrong. He said, but how can you say that? I said, because Microsoft's just become a customer. No, you don't understand. They haven't put that much money into us. It's not that big a deal. I said, it's not about their revenue. They've endorsed you.
Yeah.
Right.
You've been like anointed by, the
Yep.
IT god.
Yeah.
And the valuation then went to 200 million.
Wow.
Everyone said, and at that point we were getting reported to governments and like it got pretty gnarly.
Okay.
And even at that point we're kind of going, oh, I hope we're right on this one. But what's most important, and this is the litmus test of any valuation, a valuation, again, is only ever right with those four legs, but when money goes into someone's bank account.
Yeah.
And what happened with AirTrunk is they were oversubscribed on the 200 million. But more importantly, 3 years on, Macquarie Group bought 78% of them for $3 billion.
Wow.
And this guy
And-
was going to go and get a job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my
That's
goodness.
crazy.
And it's the same reason why accountants don't value property or gyms or, these are really bespoke assets.
Yeah.
Or horses. We were talking about horses before. But most importantly is right now there are offers going in, and it's all over the media in Australia, for AirTrunk of around $15 to $16 billion.
Oh my goodness.
Now, we didn't do that. Robin did that and his team did that. All we did was say, here's how the game's played, here's what you shouldn't do, and enable him to explain the value of the business going through. And the other one that's happening right now is, we're working with quite a few early stage companies, including one, can't quite say what it's worth, but this is literally an idea, but it's a game-changing idea. It's a particular material,
Okay.
and it could be used in a Herkle-Durkle.
For
We'll have
those
to-
who don't know, a Herkle-Durkle is when you lie in bed for longer than you need to.
Yeah.
Exactly. I'm glad I learnt that today. So, and because there's three ways you can monetize an idea. You can do what AirTrunk did, which is building out data centers, which is, very capital intensive, takes time, and obviously is risky. And the risk is because someone else could come up with a better way to do what you do. The second way is where you license it. So someone else takes on the capital and the risk responsibility, but they're paying you a fee in return for your knowledge, your know-how, your trade secrets, for example.
Yeah.
Or the third is someone just comes along, as is happening to AirTrunk now, and gives you a really large check and says, go away. 3 ways to make money. And there's often variations of those. But again, we find often the biggest mistake companies make is they only focus on one. E.g., if there's something truly special about Gilligan Shepherd, and I'm sure there is, you would do what Kelly Partners has done. That's exactly why Brett Kelly has gone and done what he's doing. He's
What's he
going
doing?
out and buying up other accounting firms and re-systematizing them and
Right.
adding value to their existing culture in a way that can ultimately be measured in terms of margin and or market share.
Okay.
Very clever.
So their particular business, we're expecting will go for well over $1 billion. They've never sold anything. But that's because that idea is worth so much. And this particular market is dominated by 3 global players, and one of them will have to buy it from the other 2. The same way Zuckerberg had to buy Instagram.
Right.
It was worth $1 billion to him, but it wasn't worth $1 billion to the 3 of us. Now, a lot of that was contextual, because he knew that if he didn't buy it, Twitter I think it already made a $500 million offer.
Yep.
And then Amazon, etc., were going to come in. In fact, it was really his relationship with the CEO of Instagram that enabled him to have that level of understanding and knowing what the number was to get the deal done.
Yeah.
Right. That's so interesting.
Okay. What common challenges or risks are associated with valuing and monetising intangible assets?
Okay, so the first mistake that everyone makes,
Yes.
including us about 8 years ago, we moved away from talking about IP because it was a legal term.
Yeah.
And then as Stephen Harrison, our chairman, said, you kind of jumped out of the legal frying pan into the accounting fire by talking about intangible assets. And because back then and still today, it really is seen as it's an accounting term. Doesn't matter how much I tell everyone I'm talking about intangible, non-physical, and it's an asset, it's worth something. They always go back to, can I bring it onto the balance sheet? Am I going to write it down? And it gets into the wrong conversation because that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So the reason we settled on intrinsic assets just over a year ago is because Stephen said, I think I've finally found the word to explain that je ne sais quoi, that special kind of something. What makes you special? In other words, why are you different from everyone else? Because you can't get that rate of return unless there is something special.
Yeah.
That's why you buy an Apple iPhone. So first one is language. Our greatest frustration is that everyone's kind of talking at cross purposes. Let me give you an example. Competitive edge, unfair advantage, secret sauce, barriers to entry, economic moats, IP, intangible assets are all the same thing.
Yeah. It's confusing.
It's a word salad.
Yeah.
And everyone's throwing buzzwords around. And
Yep.
often what you find is that within organisations, people are throwing those buzzwords around internally, but no one's actually getting down to, but which of the 10 intrinsic assets are we going to use? Is it going to build our brand? Yeah, it is. Okay, and then what sort of data are we going to drive off that? And more importantly, let's get specific about data, because for most data, it's dirt. It's actually not that valuable. So you've got to find a context for the data to monetize the data.
Yeah.
In other words, you end up having really specific conversations. So language is key. And then the next big issue is that, as we sort of talked about, if you can't give someone a list of what that stuff is, then as Drucker says, you can't manage what you can't measure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Recently, I had someone say at a conference I was at, and I won't name them, but they said you shouldn't keep a track of this stuff because then you let people know what you've got. I'm like, are you crazy?
How do you know what you've got if you don't keep track of it?
Exactly. And that was the premise I came back to. Yes, you've got to protect it in the right way.
Yeah.
Like certain things, for example, you don't tell everyone in the business. I'm sure everyone here doesn't know what everyone else earns. Some organisations maybe, but most organisations that is treated as confidential.
Yeah.
You might not happen to know the main password to the account or to the servers, for example. So things are on a need-to-know basis. And that leads into that second point, which is risk. In other words, these things have completely different risks to tangible assets. And you'd find me any business, yours included. You lock the front door, okay, when you go home. There's probably, if you're a bigger organisation, there's normally an asset management sticker sitting on this table. That goes back to an asset management system where someone, typically an auditor, once a year will come around and make sure this desk hasn't gone anywhere. There's an insurance policy on this desk if it just happens to burn down or get stolen.
Yep.
And so normally there's also someone in charge of this stuff too. Either it comes under finance or you might even have a dedicated asset manager. But that's not where the value is in the business. And then when you look at the intrinsic assets, they're not written down. They're almost certainly not insured.
Yep. Hardly even identified.
Yeah, no one's in charge of them. In fact, the first company that we're aware of that had a chief intrinsic asset officer was one of our clients, Rhino Rack in Australia. Now, again, coming back to value, slight divergent discussion. When we worked with Richard Cropley, Richard that night after we'd done the first workshop said to me, hey, look, I want to sell the business. I went, well, hopefully it was nothing we said. He said, no, I've been at this for 18 years. I'm tired. I'm literally exhausted.
Yeah.
Could you help me sell it? I said, well, okay, but we've got to build, we've started to work out what the assets are, but more importantly, we've identified you're missing some key assets. In particular, in Richard's case, they really hadn't captured their end user data. In other words, the people who actually use it, they thought it was Repco and Supercheap. That's where they put their focus. Now, to Richard that night, I said, what do you think your business is worth? And he said, $100 million. Okay, it's a big number. But Rich, I have no idea whether that's the right number or not. In fact, it's irrelevant. The number is irrelevant until there's that capital event. Now it's relevant because he wants a capital event.
Yeah.
So fast forward, by the way, this is all in the public domain.
Okay.
It's reported in the Australian Financial Review. So what ended up happening was a company out of the US called Claris ended up offering $255 million, which again is a big number, but that's the offer. What's most important is the amount of money that went into Richard Cropley's bank account, as reported, was $255 million. And as Richard said to me, it's not like my plant, my stock, my equipment went up $155 million. It was the intrinsic assets. And that's because, Ernie, who was the general manager, we put him in charge of the intrinsic assets. That was his entire job, was to look at managing those assets. So it'd be like going back to the 80s. So I remember the 80s. I don't think you do, Lucy. And if I said, hey, look, we're going to need an IT manager, everyone would have said, why? Most big businesses, only had one computer. It was a mainframe. And what you found is that then got dumped on poor old finance. Finance mostly looked after IT until it became people either something went wrong with it, whatever, and then people realised that it was a dedicated resource that you needed. And intrinsic assets are absolutely no different. I have the firm belief, in fact, I have a bet, if anyone on the podcast would like to take me up, the bet is within 10 years that every ASX 100 company will have some form of a chief intrinsic asset officer.
Okay.
And the bet is a bottle of Grange, it's about $1,000 bottle of red, and the person can pick which year they want. So it could go up to about 100,000. No one has ever taken me up on that bet. And the reason being is because history is a great predictor of the future. And those that don't learn from history are bound to repeat it.
Yeah. And
so that's why Rhino-Rack put Ernie into that role. And more importantly, when they were negotiating with Claris, no external advisors were allowed in the room.
So then how did Rhino-Rack go from 100 to 255? What was
part of it, again, going back to the 4 legs. First of all, they now knew what those assets were. We worked with them to help them work out what their intrinsic assets were. And more importantly, that they were missing some of them.
So that was around the end user data?
Yeah, end user data, and there was also some other risks, in particular around how they were protecting some of their information. They had the belief that everyone just had access to certain things, but it was inadvertent because no one knew that the particular thing we were told them about was a really key asset. Quite often you find organisations, everyone has access to a lot of information that they really don't need to have access to. Second of all is timing. Context. So this was worth a lot to Claris. Claris is a really large business.
Yeah.
But third was timing. Okay, Rhino-Rack, remember I said about COVID, some businesses had revenue pulled forward?
Yes.
Rhino-Rack absolutely had revenue pulled forward. In fact, there were periods where they literally had no stock to sell. Just couldn't make it fast enough because, of course, people couldn't leave Australia. So they were travelling within Australia. In other words, the demand side went up, which meant, and supply was constant. Absolutely helped in terms of... Now, a lot of people also, too, we didn't realise back then that would drop off. Now travel agents had no revenue, and now, good luck trying to book into a travel agent. They can't hire fast enough.
Yeah.
So those 3, but ultimately that we had also worked with Ernie to explain that to the other party, so that when Richard and Ernie were sitting in the meeting with Claris, they knew their subject matter and their business in a way that the Claris representatives didn't, meant that they could out-negotiate.
Yeah.
And typically a negotiation falls over with whoever runs out of argument first.
So he who's prepared with the most simplistic 4-legged chair wins.
Yeah, and this is why, I was saying to, I think, Joshua and Humphrey, we've never lost... let's call it a negotiation against an accountant. And the reason being is that the poor accountant only has the financial models. And we've already said they're not reflective of the value.
Yeah.
And if you don't understand not just those 4 legs, but more importantly, the 10 components of intrinsic assets, you're at a massive disadvantage. It's like trying to argue with a gemologist about the value of a diamond.
Right.
Or worse, someone who understands the value of a horse.
Right.
Horses are probably the most extreme example, highly contextual. If a horse can't run around a track fast, but it can jump 1.60 meters, it's gone from 0 to probably a $2 million horse.
Wow.
Yeah.
I thought you'd want it to run around the track fast.
But if it can't, for that context, that horse is worth 0.
Right.
But because it can jump over 1.60 meters, it's now worth probably about $2 million.
Wow.
So in other words, all that's changed is the context.
Yeah.
And so this is where we love working with accountants, as we've worked with Gilligan Shepherd on doing the financial modelling.
Mm-hmm.
But then working out the rest of it is very, very bespoke.
A difference of 155 million.
Yeah, and this is where we work with accountants. And this is why I'm sitting here on a podcast with you, because we've had that conversation. And, with Joshua and Humphrey and Bruce, they'll come to us and say, hey, look, we've got this client that's doing ABC. We don't really see where the value is, or we don't know how to explain the value. That's okay. In fairness, that's not your job.
No. Mm-hmm. We partner with people like you to get that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And thus we're here. And I wasn't quite sure if I should be wearing boxers or briefs. I wore both.
Awesome.
Boxers and Briefs is proudly brought to you by Gilligan Shepherd, the problem solvers in business.
All right, Michael, talk to me about how businesses kind of leave this to the last minute when actually they could be doing this earlier because of growth, because of having a competitive advantage, all those other reasons.
Yeah, I think, again, the word that people love using is valuation. Because that's the moment, it's like our houses. We all love talking about what our houses are worth, or because it's a way to make it tangible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The reason it's a frustration for us is I can't say how many times we've come in and someone's saying, hey, look, we need to, again, unpack that valuation into the explanation. Might be working with an accountant or their lawyer, etc. In other words, there's a capital event. Now, normally it comes about because someone makes an out-of-the-blue offer. Okay, that's what typically happens in our experience. That's number one. Number two is there's normally a health event.
Okay.
So, for example, GlidePath, the reason Ken Stevens sold GlidePath is because literally, unfortunately, a lot of Ken's friends were passing away. And he and I were at a board meeting one night and he's like, mate, I'm done.
Yeah.
My best mate passed away and I'm done. I want out of this business.
Okay.
Now, luckily, we'd worked with GlidePath for about 8 years. So they were ready.
Yeah.
And the thing is, as we know, accountants always say to us, you always want to have your business ready for sale, which is absolutely the right advice. But it needs to go beyond that, because what would you do today if you needed... So I'm very lucky in my front yard. I've got a 400-year-old tow truck.
Nice.
Yeah, and the base of it is literally wider than this table. But you had to plant that 400 years ago to have something that magnificent sitting there today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And literally I don't think you could price it because you couldn't move it. So what we say to clients is that the best thing you can do is start doing this stuff today. Start looking at how you can grow your business, not just by identifying the assets, but as I said, looking at those 3 ways to monetize your business. And we often find, in particular, our greatest frustration with New Zealand companies, closely followed by Australia. As I love saying to Australian audiences when I'm presenting over there, Kiwis are way smarter than you guys. And
Does that work?
Absolutely. Because at that point, people are like, I go, but here's the good news. They're way more trusting than you. And that's
true.
why New Zealand is better at innovation, but we are worse at commercialisation. And it's because, again, we don't know what the assets are. If you don't know what the assets are, I can tell you now, you haven't protected them the right way, unless it's by luck. And luck is normally not a good long-term strategy.
No, not at all.
So what we've got to do here in New Zealand, so I literally said to a particular minister last week, is we've got to change the language. She had just given a speech about how we're going to create economic prosperity in New Zealand, and we've got to use our networks and our relationships because we've got so much multiculturalism. They're intrinsic assets. Networks and relationships are an intrinsic asset. And I completely agreed. But I was probably the only audience that really understood what she was saying.
Yeah.
And that was Melissa Lee. And, she's gone through a pretty rough period. She's now got economic development. But, you've got the government, David Seymour, we've spent a bit of time with, and Andrew Bailey, trying to help them understand how do we change New Zealand.
Yeah.
And there's that famous speech by Sir Paul Callaghan, 25 years ago. If we're not careful, New Zealand's going to remain, a dairy, a theme park, and Australia's going to remain a quarry. Nothing has changed.
No.
And with the best efforts, and NZTE really try hard, Callaghan really try hard, but we have not reframed our language. And this starts in school. I got asked, when would you start this? High school. Last 2 years.
Yeah.
We've already seen, the YES, I think it's called the YES program, trying to get innovation in schools.
Yes.
The idea is the easy bit. It really is.
It's the commercialisation of it.
Yep. And there's 3 ways to commercialise. And being so far away, we always focus on deployment, trying to add more people, etc., grow into more countries. And that's how most New Zealand companies blow up.
Yes.
Because they end up moving a whole bunch of their key knowledge trade secrets into a country where they can't control it or they don't have access to the staff. In fact, that's how most companies create their biggest competitors. And the second way is licensing, but it's how you license. And what I can absolutely say to you, lawyers need to be involved in a license, but there are very, very, very few lawyers on the planet, let alone in New Zealand, that are expert on how to license.
Okay.
The document's the end of the process.
Yeah.
That journey about how you build, because it's like building a marriage before you've often been on a first date. So you're trying
Work
to
on
plan.
yourself.
Exactly.
All these analogies.
Licenses are like marriages. You've got to put effort and time into them. You don't just set them up and walk away. And this is why you see a lot of them fall over. But the third is where you sell. Now, the other key mistake is that they're not mutually exclusive. So, for example, one of our New Zealand clients, was one of the first ones I worked on. They ended up deploying in Australia and New Zealand. So in other words, they had teams here, physical people.
Yeah.
They licensed into the US, but we sold the rights into the Middle East because trying to do a license in the Middle East is not that easy. Even a joint venture, like the client we're working with at the moment, that's going to be a joint venture over there. And they are really nuanced. And there are very few people that have expertise at that global level that can sit with you and do that. And the question I always say to people is that most people give what I call well-intended, but it's unfortunately often bad advice.
Yeah.
And that's because it's theoretical, it's not battlefield tested. And so whenever you're taking advice from someone, especially someone like me, ask them simple questions.
Yeah.
Like if it's business advice, my favourite question is, when was the last time you lay awake at 3 a.m. wondering about payroll? Now, unless you've been a business owner, you've probably never done that. So it's really hard to take business advice from someone who hasn't gone through that.
Okay.
Or more importantly, when was the last time you did a transaction like this? When was the last time you negotiated a medical device from a small Australian company into a large US firm? So ask people what their track record is.
Yeah.
And what you then find is advice goes from very strategic, battlefield tested, to what I will call that well-intended but potentially very, very bad and dangerous advice.
Okay.
And a lot of the time,
Good tip.
we're dealing with people because they've got that. And the people are really nice.
Yeah. Nothing against them.
They're lovely and they mean well.
Yeah.
But again, I live my life on a plane.
Yeah.
And which is the other thing, don't take export advice from people who aren't gold elite because they're not out there living the dream. And exporting is hard. I say to people, it's not just can you export, because that's what most people think about, is can I export? It's should you export?
Okay.
And even exporting is, when do I export? Because you don't want to be doing it too embryonic because you won't have enough team to be able to seed into foreign markets or be able to leave the core business to go overseas. It's how I export. In other words, do I deploy, license or sell? Where do I export?
Yeah.
Certain countries are a lot easier than others. I got to say, I've just got back from Shanghai. Tough market for a bunch of reasons that are not obvious. First of all, if you're not Apple, Google, nothing works because they've shut Google off in China. So really hard to communicate. So if your business is built on Google and you're now going into China, you're going to have to change your systems almost certainly.
Right.
And so there are some quite nuanced questions about even exporting.
Okay.
But, I think what the team at NZTE are doing is fantastic. But I can tell you now, those questions are not asked. Or if they are, that's very recent. Because I know when we were working with them, and we've got a great relationship, those are not standard questions, or even Austrade in Australia, or ESG in Singapore. They're not part of, hey, because they're thinking about can you export? But
Just
again,
the one.
like most things, it's a very nuanced understanding that you've got to have. And again, take advice from people that are on the battlefield.
Right.
Yeah. Learn from mistakes.
Well, even better, learn from other people's mistakes. And
Yeah.
this is why, someone recently said, this particular barrister is charging me $2,000 for one meeting. I said, wow, that's cheap. I said, what do you mean? I said, because they can probably answer your couple of $100,000 question in one meeting.
Yeah.
That's actually incredibly valuable.
Yep.
And, lesson I learnt from a certain bearded guy who walks around in bike shorts is, pay me what you think I'm worth. And so that was a really valuable lesson for me. And this is where, again, it's the value that people bring.
Yeah.
Because what you're paying someone is to know the things that you don't, but that they do. And depending on what the quantum of the prize is or the problem, that could be really, really valuable. And that's why senior accountants get paid a lot more than junior accountants, because you're paying them for that knowledge and expertise.
Yeah. So then we've got businesses who are gearing up to sell, gearing up because of a health event, gearing up for all kinds of things. We've learnt that we need to get started on this whole process much earlier. But also getting started on the process earlier also helps businesses gain a competitive advantage. So where do they start, where they haven't even thought about this kind of thing?
Yeah. So the process, the good news, it's really simple. And like the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one small step, building value in your business starts with working out your intrinsic assets.
How do you do that?
Okay. So we give everyone a free hour, and most of the time I'm giving way more value than I'll ever charge them, but because we want to see businesses grow. And more importantly, I want to stop businesses who can't grow at that point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because there is nothing worse, because they blow up a whole bunch of really great capital that's well intended, but more importantly, they waste a lot of time, and they're not coming out with the next or the third or the fourth idea that could be, the moneymaker.
Yeah.
So just start with those 10 buckets, filling them out, like literally filling them out. I mean, I said this to Joshua the other day about you guys. I don't know if she's done it yet, but every business is essentially an intrinsic asset business.
Yeah.
But I was with one of the largest law firms in Australia. The head of their IP division couldn't tell me what their intrinsic assets were.
So the 10 buckets, the intrinsic assets, is coming up with what you think is different.
Yeah, but work out what the assets are, and then think, well, okay, which of those three categories, are they easily replicable? Because if they are, well, they're not that special.
Yeah.
Second of all, are they strategic intrinsic assets? So they're that 9% of volume that's probably comparable value. Or are they part of my 1% of my volume that's where the 90% is in my business?
Yeah.
And that's where you then start to work out what the risks are around it. Well, okay, who has access to those assets? Are we about to give them to someone as part of a joint venture deal? So, and I could spend literally an entire podcast just talking about the risk. But then 3 is, what can I do today that's going to have a compounding effect on my growth tomorrow?
What's going to grow you a
So
totra?
if I set up a license today, that license is infinitely more valuable in 5 years than if I do it in 5 years.
Yeah.
And so, Rhino Rack, I wish we could have worked with them 18 years prior, but you can't. So you've got to start with where today is. So, because what that enables you to do is at that fourth moment where you get approached, you're not leaving money on the table.
Yeah.
And then last but not least, which are really the 5 areas we get involved with them, is have I got the right people typically sitting around me? We might not need to be physically sitting next to the client as part of the negotiation. Often we are, but even if we're just on the end of the phone.
Yeah.
So, for example, with Rhino Rack, when they wouldn't let any external advisors in the room, we're on the end of the phone. Hey, we've got this question. And as I said to Ernie, if they ask you anything, go, great question, we need to think about that. Which meant we need to go and ring the guys to find out what the answer is. I hate to say it, this stuff is genuinely not hard.
Yeah.
But none of this is covered in any education. It's not covered as part of becoming a director. It's not in the IOD. It's not in the AICD. I've just done an interview for AICD. We're working with them to start to incorporate this.
Good.
So that directors will start to do it. Well, IOD we've still got to work on.
Yeah.
The tax department is certainly starting to become aware of this stuff. We are getting some interesting questions, in particular from accountants, saying, hey, we've been asked this, how do we reply? They are becoming more aware of where this hidden value is, because, it's where most value is.
Hidden.
Exactly. And, it's not really covered as part of becoming a lawyer. So the traditional advisors in this area, with the utmost of respect, are not really qualified to answer these questions. Even Intrinsica, we're more of the world's recognised intrinsic asset strategist than any other firm in the Southern Hemisphere.
Wow.
It's about to become even more than that. Yeah, it's pretty cool. And that's about to change too. I can't say that yet. I'm still embargoed. But But that comes back to we've built this incredible network of people, and we have these great relationships with people like Gilligan Shepherd where, again, no one person has all the answers.
No.
And so it's about, wrapping around these great ideas, people have got that battlefield knowledge that can get shit done, because the other big frustration that we have, in particular medical device and biotech, is they just don't run fast enough. Typically, if it's come out of a lab or a university, what kills it almost always is time.
Yep.
Okay.
The testing.
Yeah. Whereas, I love Pete Beck. Pete is one of the most impatient people I've ever met. And that's what makes him so amazing.
What's he famous for?
Rocket Lab.
Rocket Lab.
Yeah. Now, they got $13 billion worth of future orders, and they're now the most successful space company. They've just done 50 launches ahead of everyone else. And he's a Kiwi.
Yeah.
But he's
Cool.
not here for any other reason that New Zealand has the right location to be able to launch rockets.
Okay.
Like, he's really clever. That is their competitive advantage.
Yeah.
And I can't go and set up a rocket company next to him because I can't get the regulatory approval to do that. The government's not going to let me do that. And that's why he will ultimately, he's got a competitive advantage over SpaceX.
Yeah.
Because he can get more stuff into space faster. That is a competitive advantage. Having a lower cost of production is absolutely an intrinsic asset, because there are reasons why.
Yeah.
But it always comes back to those 10 buckets.
Okay, so if other accountants or business owners want to get in touch with you to find out more about this, how do they do that?
Yeah, look, luckily, there's a couple of Michael Mastersons. There is one who's apparently a very famous author. He's a multimillionaire. That's not me. There's another one, I think, who's also a Scottish professor. That's also not me.
Okay.
But I'm the third guy on LinkedIn.
Great.
So,
Process of elimination.
yeah, LinkedIn's probably the easiest. Look, it's the business Facebook or via the website. But yeah, look, what I would say, whether it's myself, there's not a lot of people doing this, but talk to your other advisors, and if they don't have the questions to some of the things that I've talked about, that probably tells you what you need to know. It doesn't mean you need to stop being your accountant or your lawyer or your patent attorney, but it's about getting the right advice. And it's like trying to build a house with a great plumber, a great electrician, a great builder, but there's no architect.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, unfortunately, often you find out that's a problem when you go to sell it,
Yeah.
and people are saying, why is there a tap in every room? And when you turn on the PowerPoint, water comes out, and that's because a plumber designed it.
Yeah.
And it's not to say they're not a great plumber, but putting water through a house is a very different concept to maximising the return on that piece of dirt.
Yeah.
And so, again, it's about having the right advice around you. And, we often find this, in particular, and obviously present company excluded, but when a client's had their account for 20 years and now we're going into an M&A deal with a large US firm or European firm, very rarely would that accountant be the right person to go through to that point.
Yeah.
And that's where, again, you need someone like a GS who's done deals like that.
Yeah.
And that's often how we end up meeting other advisors, because they're on the other side of the deal and they're like, oh, that didn't go so well for us.
Yeah. Or
Could
they
you
go,
help
what the
us?
hell do we do now? Right at the beginning.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
So, but all I would say, the best thing to do is start doing this stuff. It's not hard. It genuinely is not hard. Start writing it down. Go back, listen to this podcast 3 or 4 times, what I say to people, or Google the other stuff that I've done. Just start writing down what makes you special. Think about, what are my risks? How am I protecting it? Is there a way to make money from it sooner? If you just do that, what that's going to do is the holy grail. Because everyone says, how do I attract capital?
Mm-hmm.
It's really easy. Grow fast.
Grow fast.
If you're not growing, it is near impossible to attract capital. It's really hard. But if you're growing, you will have no problem with capital.
How do you grow? By being unique.
Yeah, but by being able to generate that margin and/or market share. Because if you've got strong intrinsic assets, in other words, you can stop other people replicating what you do.
Mm-hmm.
What that means is you can turn that into margin and use that to convert it into market share, which is how you generate a return on capital. If you're generating a better return on capital than other people, guess what they're going to do? Instead of putting it into company A, they're going to put it into your business.
Yep.
And so it becomes, this cumulative effect. And again, I know I make it sound really easy, but if you've genuinely got a great idea and you can protect it really well, and you've worked out how to grow,
Mm-hmm.
capital is not your problem. Whenever I hear someone say capital is my problem, they're not answering those 4 questions.
Okay.
What do you do? Who are your customers? how am I going to generate a better economic return out of you than anyone else? And 4, how are you going to stop or slow down competitors?
Yeah.
You answer those 4, you're not pitching for capital. Capital's pitching at you.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you
Cool.
so much for your time. It's been an eye-opener. I'll have to listen to this one back as well.
Me too.
We'll be answering those.
Did we swear enough?
Shit.
Damn. Fuck. There you go. I got one in
There
there.
you go. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank
Great to meet
you.
you both.
You too.
Boxes and Briefs is proudly brought to you by Gilligan Shepherd, the problem solvers in business.